Hi, this is Sachi Yanari-Rizzo, Curator of Prints and Drawing for a print room talk today on Enrique Chagoya. Um, if you were in the print room right now, you would ordinarily be looking at the artist's work while I give you some background on the artist. So I wanted to begin with an example of one first. Shigoya, describing his work, says, "My artwork is a conceptual fusion of opposite cultural realities that I've experienced in my lifetime. I integrate diverse elements from pre-Columbian mythology, Western religious iconography, and American pop culture. In the near distant jungle, the one we're looking at right now, you can get a sense of how he juxtaposes imagery from different sources, and with the use of satire and humor, he explores different social issues." Enrique Chagoya was born in Mexico City in 1953 and was raised there at a time of great social unrest. His father taught him to draw at a very young age. Chagoya recognizes the impact of his father's occupation on his own work. His job was at the Central Bank of Mexico in the Department of Criminology, and he was charged with the task of identifying fraud. His office was akin to a museum of forgery, complete with intaglio plates and international counterfeit paper currency that he could examine side by side. This provided the 10-year-old future artist with his first exposure to the concept of forgery, or in a sense, artistic borrowing known as appropriation. "This blew my mind," recalls Shigoya. Interestingly, Shigoya studied political economics, not art, at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and this was back in 1973 to 75. He made political cartoons for student and union newsletters at this time as well. Before finishing his degree, he took a job in Veracruz in rural development projects, which broadened his awareness of what was happening in the world. This nurtured his interest in social issues. Shigoya moved to the US in 1977 when his first wife, who was an American living in Mexico, had to return for medical reasons. "I did not emigrate," explains the artist, "I was imported." And you get a sense of Shigoya's sense of humor even with that. Shigoya also spent some time as a union organizer for farm workers in the Texas Rio Grande Valley in 1978. Shigoya worked as a freelance graphic designer and illustrator in the Bay Area. He was dissatisfied with the narrow political view in the economics programs at the local colleges. He had been making art all his life, so instead he turned to art. Shigoya received his BFA in printmaking from the San Francisco Art Institute in 1984. As a student, he turned to making cartoons again as a form of activism. He received his MFA from the University of California at Berkeley in 1987 when he began utilizing pre-Columbian imagery. From 1987 to 1990, he enjoyed his work as artistic director of the Galleria de la Raza in San Francisco, and this was an important community-based nonprofit or arts organization, and it still exists, and it seeks to increase awareness of Chicano and Latinx art. Shigoya began his teaching career in 1990, and he is currently a full professor in the Department of Art and Art History at Stanford University. And this work isn't in our collection, but I had to share this print by Shigoya because it's a good segue into talking about artists who had a profound impact on his work. And plus, I love it. When you begin looking at Shigoya's work, you will in general recognize images from pop culture, so images of like Mickey Mouse and other Disney personalities, comic book characters, but other outside influences emerge, including Spanish painter, printmaker Francisco Goya and José Guadalupe Posada, whose penny broadsides reached a large popular audience. Both Goya and Posada made satirical prints that continue to be among the most influential works in the history of art. And likewise, he says, humor is a way to survive difficult social circumstances. So in Goya meets Posada, we see the two artists meeting each other. And this next image, we see that Goya is on the right side of Shigoya's print, and we recognize him from the artist's self-portrait that was included in Goya's famous print series, La Caprichos, which is on the right. We have all kinds of connections that Shigoya made with other works. The flying bulls are from another one of Goya's print series. Posada is arm in arm with his famous female calavera figure known as La Catrina. It is a pairing that Diego Rivera imagined for a mural dream entitled Dream of a Sunday Afternoon in the Alameda Central Park, seen in the lower right. Perhaps that is Shigoya, down at the bottom right of his own print, roller skating and bearing a mask, which would then make a connection between himself and these masters of printmaking and satire. All of this borrowing of artistic images brings to mind, again, Shigoya's early memories of counterfeiting and forgery. And this is a work by Posada, two works by Posada that are in our collection. Posada, who lived from 1852 to 1913, was largely forgotten, even in Mexico after his death, until 1926, when French and Mexican artist Jean Charlot wrote about him and named him as a precursor to the post-revolution Mexican art movement. Much of Posada's work was directed to a mostly illiterate audience, so clarity would be a key. You can see in the prints in our collection that Posada eliminates superfluous details and focuses on the subject. He provides us with little clues and information in the background. And then on the right, with the argument between mothers-in-law, you can see a great example of how he exaggerates features, forms, and movement to create powerful composition. He had a gift for caricature and humor that you really see with the ruckus of the mothers-in-law. And this is we can draw some comparisons between Shigoya and Posada and the two works in our collection. On the right is the near distant jungle, and on the left, I'm sorry, is the near distant jungle, and on the right is Posada's The End of the World. Both prints show utter chaos with a pileup of figures that form a pyramidal shaped composition. Posada's literally states that it is the end of the world, and Shigoya's print shares the same feeling as large drops of some unknown substance falls from the sky. The world that has been turned upside down, the text, the near distant, is written in an old historical looking font and is upended. The more contemporary font used for jungle drawn with 3D perspective is backwards even. Our pileup of figures is composed of people with different skin tones and from different realms. We even have a blonde-haired female superhero. Different time periods, we have an outstretched hand that catches a woman, probably an indigenous woman's head. Is this an armored body part from the past, like the Middle Ages, or the future? We are in the middle of an apparent flood too, as we see only the tops of people's heads. Some writers suggest that this is a commentary on the rising sea levels due to global warming, and that climate change was a theme that was on Shigoya's mind in a 2014 exhibition of the George Adams Gallery. We saw how Shigoya worked in the satirical tradition of Posada. While Posada was the father of Mexican printmaking, Francisco Goya was the master of printmaking technique, aquatint. Shigoya created numerous literal homages to Francisco Goya in contemporary versions of Goya's Los Caprichos. Goya actually made over 300 prints during his lifetime. His famous Los Caprichos series was created from 1797 to 99. It was made up of 80 etchings that mocked Spanish society, the church, nobility, and the government, and were withdrawn from the public for publication. We have an example of Goya's Los Caprichos on the left. It's entitled Out Hunting for Teeth, which is a parody of the superstitious beliefs held at that time. A woman averts her gaze and even blocks her face as she pulls the teeth of a hanged man for the effective use in spells, as people believed. We have a detail of Out Hunting for Teeth. So aquatint was invented around 1650, so not too long before Goya was experimenting with the medium. So in this print, Goya expertly layered aquatint, and that's kind of the grainy areas that you see in the background. So he layered the aquatint on top of the etched lines to give shadows a greater richness. You could also see how deftly Goya can capture facial expressions. Like Posada, backgrounds were simplified in order to focus the eye in the foreground with the figures. Here we have an example of one of Shigoya's prints made after Goya, and this was done in 2003, and this is in our collection. But first, we're going to go back to talk about Shigoya's first print after Goya, and this was created back when he was in an undergraduate at San Francisco Art Institute in the early 1980s. His class with Robert Flynn Johnson was taught using the collection in the Achenbach Foundation for Graphic Arts, which included the work of Goya. As a final assignment, they could either write a paper or make a work of art. Being in love with Goya's work, Shigoya wondered, how hard would it be to make a print that looks exactly like a Goya print? Shigoya closely studied the size and techniques of etching and aquatint of Goya's original prints. He then traced reproduction of Goya's prints from publications that reproduced the artist's work to scale. He then transferred the drawings in reverse onto the plates, and that was so he would get the proper orientation when printed. He commented that when he drew on the plate to capture Goya's quivering lines, he had to make his own hand tremble, otherwise his lines would be too straight. He suggests that Goya must have had a trembling hand. Shigoya faithfully reproduced the prints but made contemporary replacement in faces and objects, so it wasn't exactly forgery. Since then, the artist has carefully replicated and transformed more than 30 Goya etchings since 1983. Sometimes Shigoya's self-portrait appears. Through the years, his themes parallel Goya's own of corruption, poor behavior, the disparity between poverty and wealth, and the atrocities of war. Distinctive is the red stamps in the margin. In this case, we see a menacing eye. These stamps relate to the stamps of ownership added to Goya's prints in the Spanish National Library. This was done by the dictator, General Francisco Franco's administration. This fascist government is one Goya surely would not have supported. Shigoya's own stamped image can be viewed as mocking this. Each stamp is individual and is connected back to the narrative of its work, often adding further meaning. The black and red ink coloring is intentional, alluding to colors of pre-Columbian texts, Russian constructivist design, and 20th century protest posters. Art print loyalty by Shigoya relates to Goya's print of the same name. Goya's print is plate 17 from the series Los Proverbios, or Los Disparates, from circa 1815 to 19, which continued to poke fun at the superstitions and follies of Spanish society, like Los Caprichos did earlier. Disparates is usually translated as follies. These included 22 images made around 1816 to 19 and are Goya's last etched series. Goya's print features a group of monks and friars with very beastly features, though the exact meaning remains unclear. Chagoya maintains Goya's composition with figures using the same gestures. They are all set against a plain background as well. The title retained from Goya as well remains relevant 2 centuries later. Goya's print was also known as, "He who does not like thee will defame thee in jest." Perhaps Shigoya's print warns of untrue friendships. In Shigoya's print, we see former George W. Bush in the center, who is surrounded by his close circle of confidants. So we have from left to right, Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, and on the other side of Bush is John Ashcroft, Donald Rumsfeld, and Dick Cheney. Scattered here and there are heads of Saddam Hussein. It has been suggested that it is though, despite the fall of the dictator's regime and his subsequent execution, Hussein continued to haunt the administration and the designers of war with reminders that the war had not ended and will never end in victory for the US. And this is You Are Here. It's a portfolio of 6 lithographs that are in the collection. Shigoya created this in collaboration with the poet Alberto Rios, an American poet born 1952. So for a week in July of 2000, Shigoya and Rios met at the studios of Segura Publishing Company and collaborated on a series of maps and texts. Segura was a printmaking workshop that focused on underrepresented artists, and for a period of time, they were located at the University of Notre Dame before they permanently closed a few years ago. So borders and boundaries are themes that recur in Shigoya's art. His art explores political, social, and racial boundaries between the US and especially Latin America. Borders can be conceptual, they can be physical, social, and cultural divisions. The portfolio title, You Are Here, seems to be something that you might see on a map, identifying your location in relation to everywhere else. In the series, he includes different ways of looking at and ordering the world, but perhaps also showing things we share, our commonalities. In this map, the water and land are inverted. Water is drawn where land should be and vice versa. Alberto Rios's passage is enclosed in a box in the lower left where one might find a legend and reads, "Nobody owns water. Drink some and try to keep it. Water is the blood of the land," and this is repeated in Spanish. "Water is how we are all related. Water is the solid ground of dreams." This is another print from the portfolio You Are Here. And all the titles for the works in the portfolio are just purely descriptive. In talking to the Segura Art Studio, these weren't necessarily titles. I believe that Shigoya gave, they were just descriptive titles to differentiate the pieces. So this isn't, we've entitled it Trash World according to their notes. It's a map. We have a bird's eye view of the Earth from outer space with lots of debris floating. Rios's words frame the piece on the perimeter and they begin to break down and break apart at the end. Each print includes a different red stamp. And you'll notice in this case, perhaps a flying saucer with stars. This type of map they chose here is one recalling historical constellation maps. The imagery used on the left includes various facial features. We've got all kinds of eyes and different ears and mouths from probably taken from different forms of art, different time periods. And we even have one reminiscent of an eye from Egyptian art. On the right is a face that recalls some of Shigoya's Calavera paintings done in the late 1980s. And the red stamp reuses the eye that you see on the right. Upside down world map is printed in what was described in the documentation as blood red ink. It's a very spontaneous rendering, and we have scattered handprints and fingerprints that even cross the borders, the drawn borders. The stamp looks like a detail from a street map, saying words, art, memory, rhythm, and water. Rios's poem compares our bodies to a map, saying that on a map, the lines, they look more like wrinkles on a knuckle. I can see them that when I fold my fingers, my knuckles become hills like that. And then it continues on. In contrast to the highly individualized work we just saw with the fingerprints and handprints, Theorem is made up of geometric shapes that are spare and yet have a playful quality. The squares are grouped to show their relationship with equal signs, recalling proofs in geometry. The colors of red, white, and black remind me, at least, of 20th century Russian constructivist works or Russian avant-garde artist works, Kazimir Mayevich and El Lissitzky. And many artists experimented with abstraction in the early 20th century with the belief that it was a universal language for communication in the modern world, perhaps similar to mathematics that knows no geographical or political boundaries. The highly irregular printing on the background is a nice contrast also to those flat colors and that strict geometry. I also, just for fun, included a visualization of a Pythagorean theorem that seems to share an affinity with Shigoya's shapes and his combination. This is a genome map. Shigoya uses genetic mapping in this print and the fairly universal pictographic pentagon shape forming, signifying a house. We have here the genome map, and you get a sense of that, the genetic mapping. Shigoya has images of 22 chromosomes, and for the 23rd chromosome, I'll back up a bit, you can see the X and Y chromosomes form the window and the door, so that's for the 23rd chromosome. The red stamp this time is in the upper right corner like a sun. It has a curvilinear markings reminiscent of a fingerprint, referring to our uniqueness. Rios's poem is a nice foil to the individuality reading. We can see it a little bit better here. Union is not magic or strength, but understanding. All of us in one of us walking forward. So I wanted to end with making a comparison, returning to a work by Shigoya that we saw a detail of briefly at the beginning. It's not in our collection, but it seems to relate nicely to the message in the genome map and in the map series. Um, the map series of you are, you are here. And the work is entitled Aliens Without Borders. Shigoya has used himself repeatedly in the guise of people from Africa, Europe, Mexico, Brazil, Asia, and the Middle East, but cast himself as male and female stereotypes. He said, I use my own face in the portraits to show that under any ethnic stereotype is an individual and that we are all from the same species. I do this with some sense of humor, but without trivializing the seriousness of the subject. And apparently, he had done a DNA ancestry test and learned of his very diverse background and wittily remarked, this may be a partial self-portrait of my genetic makeup within my DNA. And in a recent interview, he explained, we all have genes from different places, and at the end, we are all the same species, regardless of our color of our skin, regardless of how we look. I want to celebrate the distinction that the diversity and the differences of people. To me, that's the happy commingling of our genetic history, and I am celebrating that with this work. And Shigoya has received a lifetime printmaking award from Southern Graphics Council. His work has been in major exhibitions internationally, and his work is in collections of major museums like the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Los Angeles County Museum, the Whitney Museum of American Art, and obviously the Fort Wayne Museum of Art as well. I'm going to be taking a 2-month hiatus, but starting September 15th, we will be resuming print room talks. At that point, I'll be focusing on the work of Thomas and Mary Nimmo Moran. For this coming year, I'll be looking at different artist families with different couples or family members and how they relate to each other.